Hey everyone, it's Rebecca, your teen and tween librarian, and we're back for another episode of Bedtime Stories. Before we get started, I wanted to talk about what happened in the last chapter. We got to see through Curdy what the Goblin Palace looked like and get to overhear their grand plans for this big attack on the humans. And they're definitely being set up as the bad guys of this story. But I don't know about you, but I'm not sure they're the bad guys. I'm not even saying that the humans are either, but they seem to have some legitimate complaints. And I'm kind of wondering if that's how the story is going to go, that we're going to find out they're not such bad guys. Or maybe in a later chapter, they're going to do something awful and they will be the bad guys. The author has definitely made sure we knew how ugly they are, which is super harsh and not very nice. But is this a good versus evil thing, or is this a story about people just not understanding each other? I'm kind of curious as to what you think. Think about that tonight. Who's the bad guy in this story? And are you certain? Anyway, let's get ready for chapter 10. I'm super excited to find out what else happens. Chapter 10. The Princess's King Papa. Some of you might be wondering why I say Papa. There's two reasons for that. One, I feel that a little princess, would call her father Papa. It just sounds fancier. Second, in my family, my niece and nephew call their grandpa Papa. So it seems weird personally to me to have a father name. I know there's families out there who call dads Papa. So I'm sorry that if I'm excluding you from this. But I feel that Irene would call her dad Papa. It's a lot more fun to say too, isn't it? Papa. Okay. Back to the book. The weather continued fine for weeks, and the little princess went out every day. So long a period of fine weather had indeed never been known upon that mountain. The only uncomfortable thing was that her nurse was so nervous and particular about being in before the sun was down that often she would take to her heels with nothing worse than a fleecy cloud crossing the sun through a shadow on the hillside. And many an evening they were home a full hour before the sunlight had left the weathercock on the stables. If it had not been for such odd behavior, Irene would by this time have almost forgotten the goblins. She never forgot Curdy, but him she remembered for his own sake, and indeed would have remembered him if only because a princess never forgets her debts until they are paid. One splendid sunshiny day, about an hour after noon, Irene, who was playing on a lawn in the garden, heard the distant blast of a bugle. She jumped up with a cry of joy, for she knew that by that particular blast that her father was on his way to see her. This part of the garden lay on the slope of the hill and allowed a full view of the country below. So she shaded her eyes with her hand and looked far away to catch the first glimpse of shining armor. In a few moments, a little troop came glittering round the corner of a hill. Spears and helmets were sparkling and gleaming. Banners were flying, horses prancing, and again came the bugle blast, which was to her like the voice of her father calling across the distance, "Irene, I'm coming." On and on they came until she could clearly distinguish the king. He rode a white horse and was taller than any of the men with him. He wore a narrow circle of gold set with jewels around his helmet, and as he came still nearer, Irene could discern the flashing of the stones under the sun. It was a long time since he had been to see her, and her little heart beat faster and faster as the shining troop approached, for she loved her King Papa very dearly, and was nowhere so happy as in his arms. When they reached a certain point, after which she could see them no more from the garden, she ran to the gate, and there stood till up they came clanging and stamping with one more bright bugle blast, which said, "Irene, I am come!" By this time, the people of the house were all gathered at the gate, but Irene stood alone in front of them. When the horseman pulled up, she ran to the side of the white horse and held up her arms. The king stooped and took her hands. In an instant she was on the saddle and clasped in his great strong arms. I wish I could describe the king so that you could see him in your mind. He had gentle blue eyes, but a nose that made him look like an eagle. A long, dark beard streaked with silvery lines flowed from his mouth almost to his waist. And as Irene sat on the saddle and hid her glad face upon his bosom, it mingled with the golden hair which her mother had given her, and the two together were like a cloud, with streaks of the sun woven through it. After he had held her to his heart for a minute, he spoke to his white horse, and the great beautiful creature, which had been prancing so proudly a little while before, walked as gently as a lady, for he knew he had a little lady on his back, through the gate and up to the door of the house. Then the king set her on the ground, and dismounting, took her hand and walked with her into the great hall, which was hardly ever entered except when he came to see his little princess. Then he sat down, with the two of his counselors who had accompanied him, to have some refreshment, and Irene sat on his right hand and drank her milk out of a wooden bowl curiously carved. After the king had eaten and drunk, he turned to the princess and said, stroking her hair, "Now, my child, what shall we do next?" This was the question he almost always put to her first after their meal together, and Irene had been waiting for it with some impatience. For now she thought she could be able to settle a question which constantly perplexed her. "I should like you to take me to see my great old grandmother." The king looked grave and said, "What does my little daughter mean?" "I mean the Queen Irene that lives up in the tower, the very old lady, you know, with the long hair of silver." The king only gazed at his little princess with a look which she could not understand. "She's got her crown in her bedroom," she went on, "but I've not been in there yet. You know she's there, don't you?" "No," said the king very quietly. "Then it all must be a dream," said Irene. "I half thought it was, but I couldn't be sure. Now I am sure of it. Besides, I couldn't find her the next time I went up." At that moment, a snow-white pigeon flew in at an open window and settled upon Irene's head. She broke into a merry laugh, cowered a little, and put her hands up to her head, saying, "Dear Dovey, don't peck at me. You'll pull out my hair with your long claws if you don't mind." The king stretched out his hand to take the pigeon, but it spread its wings and flew again through the open window, when its whiteness made one flash in the sun and vanished. The king laid his hand on the princess's head, held it back a little, gazed into her face, smiled half a smile, sighed half a sigh. "Come, my child, we'll have a walk in the garden together," he said. "You won't come up and see my huge, great, beautiful grandmother then, King Papa?" said the princess. "Not this time," said the king very gently. "She has not invited me, you know, and great old ladies like her do not choose to be visited without leave asked and given." The garden was a very lovely place. Being upon a mountainside, there were parts in it where the rocks came through in great masses, and all immediately about them remained quite wild. Tufts of heather grew upon them, and other hardy mountain plants and flowers, while near them would be lovely roses and lilies and all pleasant garden flowers. This mingling of the wild mountain with the civilized garden was very quaint, and it was impossible for any number of gardeners to make such a garden look formal and stiff. Against one of these rocks was a garden seat, shadowed from the afternoon sun by the overhanging of the rock itself. There was a little winding path up to the top of the rock, and on top another seat. But they sat on the seat at its foot because the sun was hot, and there they talked together of many things. At length the king said, "You were out late one evening, Irene." "Yes, Papa. It was my fault, and Ludi was very sorry." "I must talk to Ludi about it," said the king. "Don't speak loud to her, please, Papa," said Irene. "She's been so afraid of being late ever since. Indeed, she has not been naughty. It was only a mistake for once." "Once might be too often," murmured the king to himself as he stroked his child's head. I can't tell you how he had come to know. I'm sure Curdie had not told him. Someone about the palace must have seen them, after all. He sat for a good while thinking. There was no sound to be heard except that of a little stream which ran merrily out of an opening in the rock by where they sat, and sped away down the hill through the garden. Then he rose, and, leaving Irene where she was, went into the house and sent for Ludi, with whom he had had a talk that made her cry. When, in the evening, he rode away upon his great white horse, he left 6 of his attendants behind him, with orders that 3 of them should watch outside the house every night, walking round and round it from sunset to sunrise. It was clear he was not quite comfortable about the princess. And that's the end of chapter 10. Thank you for joining me for another installment of Bedtime Stories. Make sure you never miss an episode by subscribing to the library's YouTube channel. You can also find out what else is happening with the library by finding us on Facebook, Twitter, or Instagram. Or you can always visit the library's website. I hope you'll join me for another episode, but until then, be well and sleep well.